Imagine a road, just a thin, grey line swallowed by mountains that claw at a bruised sky. You're alone, until you see him, a shadow in your mirror. And then, you know, you're not alone anymore. You're hunted. The voice of the wind, a mournful, keening sound, sculpted the silence of the vast Glen Etive. Sarah shivered, pulling her fleece tighter around her, despite the car's warm interior. Outside, the landscape was a tapestry of raw beauty and brooding desolation. Jagged peaks, crowned with mist-wreathed summits, thrust skyward, their slopes draped in a patchwork of heather and bracken, still damp from the morning's relentless drizzle. The sky above was a restless canvas of greys and bruised purples, promising more rain to come. "Incredible, isn't it?" Ben murmured, his eyes drinking in the vista. He nudged the volume of the folk music on the radio, a melancholic tune that seemed to echo the very soul of the Highlands. Sarah managed a weak smile. Yes, incredible and a little intimidating. They had ventured deep into the heart of the Scottish Highlands, leaving the well-trodden tourist routes far behind. This trip was supposed to be about reconnecting, escaping the relentless pressures of city life, and rediscovering the spark that felt like it had been slowly dimming between them. But as the roads narrowed and the silence deepened, a different kind of pressure had begun to build, a subtle, creeping unease that settled in the pit of Sarah's stomach. "Don't be silly," Ben chuckled, patting her knee reassuringly. "It's just scenery, magnificent scenery." He didn't quite understand. It wasn't the scenery itself that was unsettling, but the sheer emptiness, the feeling of being utterly alone in this ancient, wild place. The villages they'd passed were few and far between, clusters of stone houses huddled against the elements, each one radiating an air of quiet self-sufficiency, a world away from their frantic urban existence. The roads, increasingly single-track, were ribbons of tarmac carved through the wilderness, often without another vehicle in sight for miles. I wish we hadn't taken this shortcut," Sarah confessed, her gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. Ben consulted the sat-nav again, his brow furrowed slightly beneath his sandy hair. "It's still the fastest route to Fort William according to this, and honestly, look around, Sarah. This is what we came for, isn't it? To get away from it all?" He was right, in a way. This was the Scotland they'd dreamed of, the rugged, romantic landscape from the brochures and travel documentaries. But the reality felt different, rawer, less curated. There was a palpable sense of isolation here, a feeling of being exposed, vulnerable. They drove on in relative silence for another half hour, the only sounds the hum of the engine, the mournful wind whistling past the windows, and the occasional bleating of unseen sheep hidden amongst the heather. The road twisted and turned, climbing and dipping, each bend revealing another vista of stark, breathtaking beauty. Then, in the rearview mirror, a shape began to materialize. At first, it was just a distant speck, quickly swallowed by the undulating landscape. But then, it reappeared, larger, more defined. A vehicle. In this vast emptiness, another vehicle felt significant, almost intrusive. It was a Land Rover Defender, old and battered, caked in mud and grime. The kind of vehicle that looked like it belonged in this rugged terrain, like it had clawed its way out of the very earth itself. For a long time, it simply remained a distant presence, a shadow in their mirrors. Sarah found herself glancing at it more and more frequently, a prickle of unease forming on the back of her neck. Is that car getting closer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben glanced in the rearview mirror, his humming fading away. Yeah, looks like it. Probably just someone heading the same way. He tried to sound nonchalant, but Sarah could detect a subtle shift in his tone, a hint of the same unease that was gripping her. The Land Rover continued to gain ground, its bulky silhouette growing larger in the mirror. It wasn't tailgating, not exactly, but it was definitely closing the distance, its presence becoming increasingly prominent, increasingly focused. "It's a bit close, isn't it?" Sarah repeated, her voice a little louder this time, a touch of anxiety creeping in. Ben adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowed. "Yeah, it is a bit. Maybe he's in a hurry." He accelerated slightly, increasing their speed, but the Land Rover mirrored his pace, maintaining the same unnervingly close distance. The road ahead narrowed further, becoming even more winding, the heather-covered banks rising up on either side, effectively boxing them in. Passing places were now even scarcer, small indentations in the verge that looked barely large enough for a single car, let alone two, to squeeze past. Suddenly, the Land Rover's engine note changed. It roared, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in the still air, and it surged forward with unexpected speed. It pulled out to overtake, its massive frame momentarily eclipsing their smaller car, blocking out the already dim light. Sarah tensed, bracing herself, expecting it to roar past and disappear down the road. But it didn't. Instead of completing the overtake, the Land Rover swerved violently, cutting sharply in front of them, its mud-splattered rear bumper looming alarmingly close. Ben reacted instantly, slamming on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest, the car lurching forward as the anti-lock braking system kicked in. They narrowly avoided a collision, coming to a jarring halt just inches from the Land Rover's tail. "Jesus Christ!" Ben exclaimed, his voice sharp with adrenaline and shock, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" The Land Rover slowed to a crawl, moving forward just a few meters, then stopping completely, effectively blocking the narrow road. Sarah's heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. This wasn't just impatience. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. "Ben," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her throat tight with rising panic. "Ben, what's happening?" The driver's door of the Land Rover swung open with a heavy clang. A figure emerged, slowly, deliberately, silhouetted against the grey sky. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his build solid and imposing. He moved with a measured, unnerving slowness, as if every step was carefully considered, each movement imbued with a sense of purpose. He started to walk towards their car, his boots crunching on the loose gravel verge. He was still in shadow, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of a dark, flat cap. Sarah could only make out the outline of his jaw, strong and square, and the heavy set of his shoulders beneath a dark, bulky jacket. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Sarah's initial shock, turning her blood to ice. This was no longer just road rage. This was something far more primal, far more menacing. The vast, desolate landscape, which had moments ago seemed beautiful and awe-inspiring, now felt like a trap, an isolating prison. "Ben," Sarah whispered again, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "The doors. Lock the doors, Ben. Please." Ben, still dazed and shaken, fumbled for the central locking button on the driver's side door. His movements were slow, clumsy, his hands trembling almost as much as Sarah's. The locks clicked into place, a small, inadequate sound against the overwhelming silence of the moorland, just as the figure reached their car. He stopped beside Ben's door, his large frame looming over the small vehicle. He didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't gesture. He simply stood there, a silent, imposing presence, looking in at Ben through the driver's side window. His silence was more terrifying than any angry outburst could have been. It was the silence of intent, the silence before a storm. Sarah huddled back in her seat, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the figure outside. She could now discern more details in the dim light. His jacket was heavy, dark waxed cotton, the kind worn by farmers and gamekeepers in this unforgiving landscape. His boots were thick-soled work boots, scuffed and muddy. His hands were large and weathered, hanging loosely at his sides, fists almost clenched, radiating a sense of brute strength. Time seemed to stretch, each second agonizingly slow, each breath shallow and ragged. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the frantic thump of Sarah's heart and the wind whistling through the heather. Ben, slowly regaining his composure, leaned forward, his voice trembling but determined. He tentatively wound down the window a fraction, just enough to speak to the looming figure outside. Can we help you? We had an accident. We swerved to avoid a sheep. The figure remained motionless, his head tilted slightly, as if considering Ben's words, or perhaps simply not registering them at all. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a statue carved from shadow and menace. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand. Sarah flinched back instinctively, her eyes squeezed shut, bracing herself for violence. But instead of reaching for the door handle, as she'd expected, he placed his large hand flat against the window, directly in front of Ben's face. His palm was rough, calloused, and unsettlingly close. He pressed down, hard. The pressure on the glass was palpable, a physical manifestation of the menace emanating from him. The window bowed slightly inwards, the glass protesting with a faint creak. Sarah could feel the vibration through the car, the sheer force of his hand pressing against the fragile barrier between them and him. The silence inside the car became suffocating, broken only by the ragged sound of Sarah's breathing and the faint, strained creak of the window. Ben remained frozen, his eyes wide with terror, his face pressed against the glass, inches from the man's rough hand. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The figure stepped back from the car, his hand dropping back to his side. Sarah and Ben remained frozen, holding their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests, waiting, dreading what would come next. But instead of attacking, instead of speaking, the figure simply turned. He turned and walked back towards his Land Rover, his movements still slow, deliberate, unsettlingly purposeful. He never looked back, never broke his silence. He reached his vehicle, climbed back inside, and slammed the door with a resounding thud that echoed in the valley. The Land Rover's engine roared to life, the sound shattering the oppressive silence, filling the valley with its deep, predatory rumble. Sarah and Ben watched, petrified, as it reversed, turned in the narrow track, its headlights cutting through the gathering gloom, and then, with a final, menacing growl, drove away, disappearing back down the single-track lane in the direction they had come. They sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, the echoes of the Land Rover's engine slowly fading away, swallowed by the vastness of the moorland. The silence that followed was even more profound, more oppressive than before, heavy with unspoken fear and the lingering presence of the encounter. Finally, Ben let out a shaky, shuddering breath, the sound echoing in the confined space of the car. "What? What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, strained, barely audible above the wind. Sarah shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the empty road ahead. Unable to speak, she felt cold, clammy, and utterly terrified, the primal fear still gripping her like a vice. She had no explanation, no logic, no rational framework to understand what they had just experienced. It was beyond road rage, beyond anger, beyond anything she had ever encountered or imagined. It was something darker, something predatory, something inhuman. After a long, trembling silence, Ben, with a visible effort, reached for the ignition key. Miraculously, the engine turned over, sputtering to life, filling the car with the reassuring, albeit slightly shaky, sound of mechanical normalcy. He cautiously put the car in reverse, and with a groan and a lurch, they managed to back it onto the track, the small car protesting audibly as it climbed the shallow embankment. It was scratched, dented, and probably needed a mechanic, but it was drivable. It was escape. Without a word, without even exchanging a glance, Ben put the car in drive and accelerated, driving on, but in the opposite direction to the one the Land Rover had taken, back towards the main road, back towards civilization, back towards the faint glimmer of safety. The landscape, which had moments ago held a strange, unsettling beauty, now felt overtly menacing, each shadow seeming to hold the looming, silent shape of that figure, each gust of wind whispering with his unspoken rage. They drove for miles in silence, the unspoken terror hanging heavy in the air between them. The laughter and shared playlists of the start of their trip were distant memories, lost somewhere back on a sunnier, safer road. The silence in the car was no longer the companionable quiet of shared enjoyment, but a heavy, suffocating silence filled with unspoken fear, the chilling echo of their encounter in the desolate Scottish Highlands. They reached Loch Ness hours later, the tourist bustle and cheerful clamour of the small town feeling jarringly unreal, almost offensively cheerful, after the stark, terrifying isolation they had just endured. Even days later, back home in the city, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of urban life, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of profound unease. She kept seeing the image of the Land Rover in her rearview mirror, the looming figure at the window, the unnerving silence, the cold, dead eyes she now imagined beneath the shadow of his cap. The memory of the beauty of Scotland was now inextricably linked in her mind with a deep, visceral sense of vulnerability, a chilling understanding of the raw, untamed power of the wilderness and the darkness that could lurk within it. They had escaped, physically unharmed, returned to the safety of their ordinary lives, but something had irrevocably shifted. Something had broken in the remote heart of the Highlands, and Sarah knew with a chilling certainty that settled deep within her bones that they would never truly forget the silent rage they had encountered on that desolate Scottish road, a rage as ancient and unforgiving as the landscape itself.